So let's recap the story that we saw last week. We saw David patiently waiting for God to fulfill his promises, and David winning over the hearts of the people, and he becomes the king of Israel. And we see David becoming more and more powerful, but David also acknowledging that it was God who brought him this far, and God was the one who made him rise to be king. And David acknowledges that. And God makes a covenant with David and says that your kingdom will endure forever before me, your throne will be established forever. And this is a huge covenant that God makes with David. And David continues to win battles, and God gives him victory wherever he goes. And we see him continuing to become a more powerful king. But we see a huge failure in the side of David when he takes Bathsheba to be his own wife, kills her husband in the war, and we see that God is very displeased with what David has done, and says these words to David that the sword will never depart from your house, and out of your own household I'm going to bring calamity on you. And those words do end up becoming true, and David has to flee from his own son Absalom because Absalom takes over Israel, and David, frightened for his own life, has to flee from Jerusalem. And later Absalom dies, and we see David being broken about that, and he's weeping and crying for his son. However, later he continues to do his duties as king, and he goes and meets the people. And there are several other stories that look into the character of who David is. And at the end of the book of 2 Samuel, we see the song that David sings to God. And summarizes the essence of David's character. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation. So we see David as someone who completely relies on God and takes refuge in God. And we see that for David, his strength and security comes only from God. Later, Solomon becomes the king, and when God appears to Solomon and asks what he wants, and Solomon humbly asks for wisdom and discernment. And God is very pleased with what Solomon asks, and we see Solomon growing in wisdom, making wise decisions for the kingdom of Israel, and the kingdom of Israel just prospers. Everyone is happy, and there's safety and security and in the kingdom of Israel. And Solomon also continues to grow in wisdom and in the arts, the sciences. He writes many songs and proverbs, and David has great wisdom and insight. And Solomon. And Solomon also builds the temple, and we see the presence of God coming into the temple, and Solomon makes this wonderful prayer of dedication when the temple is built. God, however, continues to appear Solomon and reminds him and warns him, saying that you have to be obedient and follow my decrees. Solomon, although he makes wise, prosperous decisions for the kingdom, and he grows in wealth and prosperity, and everyone seeks to come and know how wise and great his kingdom is, he turns away from God, and he marries many wives, and all of them have different gods, and Solomon is led astray by that. And he even builds an altar for another god, and God is very angry with Solomon and says that since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I have commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. So God says that eventually the kingdom of Israel will tear apart. And God also raises other enemies for Solomon. And at the end of his life, we see Solomon as someone not fully devoted to God. And after he dies, his son Rehoboam becomes the king.